Higher education has many moral failings, and one of those is the pervasiveness of cheating, of dishonesty, of plagiarism. And what I'm really interested in is, why does the left seem to keep getting away with it over and over again?
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. My guest today is Phil Magness, who works at the Independent Institute, and we're going to be talking about his work uncovering some of the plagiarism and the scandal at Harvard University with then President, now ex-President Claudine Gay, and he's also an economist, and so I'm sure we'll talk about some of his economic work. But Phil, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And like I said, I know you more as an economist and some of your economic work, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. But before we do, I know you had a pretty pivotal role in some of the Claudine Gay scandal, but I'm more familiar with Aaron Sabarium and Chris Rufo's role in all of that. So I'd love for you, in your own words, to describe what you were doing, what you saw happening, and how you participated in all of that. And then also explain, maybe some of our listeners don't know, but I suspect many of them do, what exactly was happening at Harvard with Claudine Gay and the whole saga.
Sure thing. So it's been kind of a wild ride for the past several months as the scandal unfolded. But I guess my part in the story actually goes back several years. So in 2019, I published a book co-authored with Jay Brennan called Cracks in the Ivory Tower, which is an ethical assessment of the U.S. university system. And as the subtitle of the book suggests, higher education has many moral failings, and one of those is the pervasiveness of cheating, of dishonesty, of plagiarism. And now in the book, we focused on mainly how this occurs in the classroom, because we know that plagiarism is often a very strong rule that's in place as a norm in higher education, that if you get caught in the classroom, this is usually the type of an offense that you either get expelled or you fail the class or you have a really serious penalty. And this is true at almost every university and college in the United States. It's just like plagiarism is just a no-go. You don't do that. And
Right, of course.
we teach students specifically, if they're caught plagiarizing, it's maybe the first time they get a slap on the wrist, but afterwards it's entirely on them, and it can wreck their entire undergraduate or graduate school careers if they do this. So the book itself basically got me into the area of academic ethics, moral failings in higher education. And over the years that followed, I had been involved in exposing and studying and interpreting some other cases, including a plagiarism case that happened at Princeton University with a prominent left-wing professor, Kevin Kruse. I found copies of entire paragraphs that were cut and paste into his dissertation without appropriate citations. Okay, there was an example where he borrowed another person's book about the city of Detroit, changed the city location to Atlanta, and then used the same text to describe it. So pretty egregious type of stuff. And it was involved in that, as well as some other exposing some data fraud, economic controversies that occurred with other scholars, usually very prominent left-wing economists. So it kind of a subfield of my own study has been digging into academic misconduct cases and explaining why these things happen. And what I'm really interested in is, why does the left seem to keep getting away with it over and over again? So when the Claudine Gay rumors started to pop up, and they were this was right after her notorious congressional testimony, where she kept saying, "Well, it depends on the context," for all these probing questions about anti-Semitic hate on campus. Well, as that broke, it kind of resurfaced old rumors that had been lingering for years about maybe her academic work was not up to quality, not up to the standards of Harvard. And one of those rumors was that she seemed to have been excessively reliant on other sources in copying some text, copying some patterns and descriptions of how she did data techniques. So that rush of attention after the congressional hearing meant people started digging into and resurfacing some of these older complaints. And normally where there's smoke, there's fire. What happened next is that the discovery of one or two plagiarized passages causes you to look for more, and that causes you to look for more. So it's like a snowballing effect. And what originally looked like it was taking place in maybe one or two articles, suddenly you have 7 or 8 different articles that she's written that have plagiarized passages. So my role in that came about. I'd say it was probably early November when all of this is just starting to pop up as a discussion topic. Aaron Sabarium of the Free Beacon and Chris Rufo of the Manhattan Institute were investigating it, and I was one of the people that they contacted with lists of examples for plagiarism. And it was basically, you work on academic ethics, you work on plagiarism. Can you evaluate these, look over them, and tell us, is this what we think it is, basically? So, being someone who is not on the political left, but who does academic ethics, really got me into that story. And from there, then I noticed, yes, these are examples that are clearly copied, clearly cut and paste, not using proper citations. They meet the definition of plagiarism that Harvard applied to its students. So I started looking myself into some of Claudine Gay's other articles, and lo and behold, more of them show up, more examples show up, including one that she had to correct. So about the second or third time Harvard offers an excuse, first they tried to bury the story. The second time they're like, well, maybe she could have been more clear in her citations, but there's nothing wrong with it. And the third time is, I am submitting corrections to this article in the American Political Science Review. Well, the one example that I found was the line that she had to correct. So it was the first one, I think, that she admitted she actually did something inappropriate. But the snowballing effect plays out over basically the Christmas break, and then it's by the beginning of January, it just became too much for her to excuse away and endure all of these different examples. So as a result, she resigned.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. It's fascinating. How do you go about finding a case of plagiarism? Like, I know this is something professors worry about is, are my students plagiarizing? Now I think they worry about, is ChatGPT writing the article or the essay for them?
Right.
But, if you're assessing potential act of plagiarism when you're doing your research, how did you go and find, like, here's the smoking gun?
Exactly. Well, usually the very first instance of it almost happens by happenstance. It's someone who has read another book and they recognize a line that jumps out because it looks familiar for some reason. And that's what happened with me with the Kevin Kruse case. I was reviewing an academic work that he had written for a scholarly journal, and I read this line, and I was like, I've seen that before. I didn't quite realize where, but it looked a little too familiar. And then I started digging around, and I found, oh, wait a minute, that comes from another very obscure source that I just happened to be familiar with. And usually once that starts, your attention is piqued. You start looking for other examples. Think, well, maybe if they did it in this one place, there might be others. Then you start more meticulously searching for it. So like in the Claudine Gay case, we knew a few examples existed in one or two articles. Well, it's like, well, let's go look at some of her other articles and see if there are similar passages. And you start reading them over. You start reading some of the sources that she copied from in the original issues, and they were on the same subject matter. And then you start seeing some of the lines appear with very distinctive similarities. That's when you start comparing them against like Google Books and the scholar databases of JSTOR and things like that. And then eventually AI can be brought in. Eventually these search services such as turnitin.com, but they're usually the third or fourth step. That's like casting the wider net. It wouldn't make sense to just randomly submit everything into turnitin.com. But if you already have a clue, there's a smoking gun sitting there of a known plagiarized passage, then it's probably in your interest to start searching if the passages around it are also plagiarized. And it turns out that's what happened with Claudine Gay.
That makes sense. And I know for Claudine Gay, she had to resign as president of Harvard, but, in the case of Kevin Kruse, literally lifting whole passages and just changing very, very minor details and then passing them off as the same. I mean, that's, to me, is totally staggering. But what's the impact or the ramifications for people who are doing this? You said earlier, like, they keep getting away with it. Could you describe that more?
Yeah. So in Cruce's case, he got away with it. After I think it was the second or third time I tried to alert Princeton University that I had found these issues, and I did it all by the books. Wrote their dean of academic integrity and said, "Take a look here," and they just ignored me until I wrote it up in Reason magazine, and then a couple other sources gave some interviews on what I had found, and then suddenly it was a big news story, and then the dean came kind of crawling back and said, "Oh, wait a minute, we found this email you sent us 6 months ago. Can you please tell us your evidence?" So I did everything by the books. I gave them lists of examples, both from the article and other ones that I had found, and put them side by side with Princeton's own published policies, which said very clearly, these would count as plagiarism in the classroom. Not only that, I had public statements by Cruce himself attacking other people for plagiarism and saying, like, I would fail a student that did this. And then it turns out it's the exact same thing he was doing. So what did Princeton do? Well, they sat on it for several months. They never contacted me again. They claimed they were doing this investigation, but it was all like this rigged behind the scenes thing. I was never interviewed for it, never asked to provide any evidence for it. And then just one day, he announces on his Twitter feed that he has basically been let off the hook with a minor slap on his wrist for this.
There was some sort of maybe like formal, like I guess some sort of notice or something.
Whatever it
But
was,
really,
it wasn't public, and it does not seem to have affected his career trajectory at all. And even more than that, the people that defended him, just like the people that defended Claudine Gay, so the tactic they adopted was to attack the people who discovered the plagiarism and attack our motives. It wasn't like a discussion over, well, does this meet the standard of plagiarism or not? It's, well, Phil Magness comes from the political right. There obviously he has an axe to grind, and he's probably funded by evil dark money and all these things, none of which is true in that sense. But that's the claim. It's a conspiracy theory claims. And because I was of the wrong political view for academia, therefore, no matter how airtight my evidence was, no matter how strong it was, I was to be dismissed. In Claudine Gay's case, I likened it to maybe a new category. We can call it critical plagiarism theory. It only counts as plagiarism if it's against your political enemies on the right, whereas if the left does it, it's for a righteous cause, and therefore it's excusable.
Yeah, and how prevalent do you get the sense? Maybe you don't have empirical studies, but thinking through the work that you did in Cracks in the Ivory Tower, and how prevalent is plagiarism in the academy amongst the professors?
Yeah, well, I have to conclude probably at this point it's far more pervasive than we would like to admit. So in Cracks in the Ivory Tower, we studied some data on students, so student responses to surveys, and there are several examples of these where they try to detect rates of cheating in the classroom. And it turns out almost everybody admits to a little bit of cheating, and some people admit to quite a bit of cheating. And it's often in places, it's like the blow-off classes, the ones you really don't care about, but you're required to take to get the credit for graduation. Students often admit, yes, we cheat on our tests, we cheat on our papers, we do it a little bit just to make it easier, and it just kind of skirts by. The more egregious cases, yes, they'll have strict penalties to them, and almost every university, again, has like honor codes. So I think plagiarism was the second most written up honor code violation at Harvard in the last year that we have data before Claudine Gay on the student level. So they are actually expelling students and suspending people for doing the exact same thing that she did. So it's clear that this happens. We don't know for certain how widespread it is at the professor level, but in the wake of Claudine Gay and some of these other scandals, it's made people take a more scrutinizing eye to academic work. And there have probably been a half dozen more major plagiarism cases at the Ivy Leagues that have come out in just the last 4 or 5 months in the wake of Claudine Gay. So that tells me that this is probably a more pervasive, widespread problem than we would care to admit.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that would also maybe perhaps explain why there's nothing to see here. Don't pay attention.
Exactly.
It's once you start looking, once you open that wider net. There's we'll be surprised how much of it we'd find. I'm also curious to hear your perspective on like what we should do about this. Because I mean, I think the reason it matters from the perspective of having all of your professors, not all of them, but large swaths of them cheating and plagiarizing while submitting this honor code is it's obviously clearly hypocritical,
Yeah.
a deviation from standards of excellence, standards of fairness and integrity. But what should we do in terms of reforming this aspect of plagiarism and academic integrity?
Well, first, the politics needs to be removed from it. It shouldn't matter what political perspective you're arguing from. If you engage in plagiarism, it's plagiarism. And that's kind of the case that
Absolutely.
I've been trying to make. You know, Kevin Cruz, Claudine Gay, some of these other examples. If they do things that their own students in the classroom would be penalized or expelled for, I think at a bare minimum we should hold our faculty to the same standards, if not higher standards, than the average undergrad. Like a 19-year-old might have a slim defense in that they've never really done professional research before, and they may not fully know citation practices by the time they arrive in English 101 or political science 101. So yeah, if they mess up there, that's like a learning experience. It should still have a penalty, but it could be recoverable. But we're talking about professors who have been at this game for 20 or 30 years, people that have published in academic journals themselves. There's not really a good excuse for doing that sort of thing and just claiming, oh, I was sloppy or it was an accident. That really doesn't fly with me, especially when it's a recurring pattern. So, we've kind of fallen into this state because academia is so politicized in the leftward direction, and really has become so in the past 20 years. I mean, it was always left of center, but now they're like approaching a supermajority of faculty identifying the political left. There's no other perspective. And I think that combined with a high tolerance for plagiarism has really given us a sorry state of affairs where if you have the right political views and you have the right connections, you're at an elite university, you can actually get away with a lot more than just an average undergraduate in a typical English 101 classroom could. So that seems to be an inversion of the way things should be, just on a basic ethical grounds. And the real determinant there that I keep coming back to is, in fact, the politics. These are people that push left-wing politics and activism as their primary means of scholarly communication.
That makes sense. Yeah. So if we're going to maybe rebalance the faculty, I mean, I remember I was talking not to, pretty recently to a professor. He'll remain nameless. University to remain nameless. Like something like 1,000 professors or 1,000 faculty members of various stripes. And
Right.
he was like, I don't know everyone, but if I had to count, probably about a dozen conservative faculty members out of
That's
1,000.
exactly it.
I don't know what that percentage is. That's something tiny. How would the rebalancing fix the problem? Is there other things that might need to change? Would potentially
Yeah.
Congress need to get involved in terms of the funding and tax exempt status, things of that sort, for really reining this in, or would it just be a matter of having a more balanced professoriate actually cause more mingling, more debate, more
Yeah.
scrutiny, and that'd be more what you're getting after?
Yeah, I'd be happy at this point. I think it's gone so far to the left. I'd be happy to return to about the balance we had maybe in 1995 or 2000. And you can look at the survey data, and this is the really interesting thing. So the leftward turn in academia, it's a very recent phenomenon. The university has, of course, always been kind of to the left of center. We know this going all the way back to William F. Buckley and Gordon Mann at Yale. He pointed out this problem. So that's a known entity, but it was kind of a stable left-wing plurality where they were maybe 40 to 45% of the professors, and then you'd have 30% are conservatives, and the remainder are moderates. It's not an exact balance, but all perspectives are certainly represented. And that stable ratio, where the left was only maybe about 40 to 45%, it held from the 1960s until about 2000 in the survey data. And then after 2000, it just goes off the rails. Everything veers left. Conservatives and moderates start retiring, and they're replaced by left-wing professors. And here we are 20 years later. It's just a monolithic echo chamber in certain disciplines, especially the humanities. So how do we rebalance it? How do we get back to even where we were 20 years ago? Part of it is breaking down some of the tools and instruments they've used to get ideological conformity. So mandatory DEI statements are basically just used as a litmus test to exclude any non-far left, non-critical theory style scholar from the applicant pool. And they're actually making hiring decisions where the DEI statement weighs in more than scholarly accomplishments, teaching evaluations, number of publications. It's used as the veto point. And I absolutely do think there's a First Amendment basis in public universities for state legislatures to ban the use of DEI statements as a mechanism for academic hiring. So that's at least one of the components of it. I think there's also a component that's connected on the funding side. Many academic disciplines are declining in rigor. They're declining in ethical standards. They're basically just producing activist left-wing dreck. I mean, they aren't even putting out scholarship anymore in some of these disciplines. It's all teaching students how to agitate and protest, and activism has become valorized in many of the humanities. Well, think about why we fund higher education. The public is sold to make this multi-billion-dollar investment every year in our public university system because we want to advance scientific knowledge. We want a more educated population. We want college opportunities and degrees for our children and grandchildren. All of these good, high-minded, public-sounding things. These are the rationales that we give money to the university systems at the level that we do. And yet if universities are taking that money and instead putting it into the Department of Activist Studies to like stand on the picket line and demand wealth redistribution, you're basically subsidizing political activism. That's not why the public was sold or bought into publicly funding universities. So I would say there is actually a basis for state legislatures on just basic public finance principles of democratic oversight of how public money is spent, to say, well, maybe this university, we are going to invest in the STEM fields and the physical sciences that still have scholarly rigor, but you don't need an English department consisting of 75 tenured Marxists. And that's kind of the situation that we're in some of these universities. Or maybe legislatures could say you can only hire faculty at the level that you can sustain by majors in that discipline. Because you find all of the most politicized departments, and this is history and philosophy and English and sociology, anthropology, all these humanities and social sciences that are on the far left, they're shedding majors like crazy. They can't get students in their own classrooms because no one wants the activist drag. So if a legislature said, you can't hire any more English faculty unless you have the number of majors to demonstrate that there's a demand for this, that would very, very quickly shut down some of the subsidized activism that we're seeing.
That all makes sense. It all aligns with a lot of the things that ISI has been saying and doing on campuses for the last 70 years about the overly leftist and anti-American sentiment amongst professors and faculty and the college administration. So a lot of it would be a lot of the things that you've just said. I think would be welcome.
Absolutely,
welcome reforms. But let me take a huge dramatic shift from talking
Sure.
about education to talking about your work on economics. I know you as an economist, and you work with the American Institute for Economic Research. I think a lot of your books focus, in addition to some of the social and moral things that we've been discussing, also on economic research. You're engaging in economic debates. We're in an election year. I want to ask
Yes.
you, what do you think are the best and worst ideas happening on both the left and the right now? As it seems like we're in a very big position or period of transition, sort of reconceptualizing or re-engaging or realigning things. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll start with the left first. Best and worst ideas
Absolutely.
coming from the left, from an economic perspective primarily.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there aren't many good ideas coming out of the economic left right now that I've seen. And this is even a shift from like the Obama administration, which it was very much on the left politically, but the economic advisors that Obama brought in were kind of like center left Keynesians that came out of mainstream institutions. Joe Biden has jettisoned all of that and brought in like the modern monetary theory crazy people from the new school and stuff like that. So,
can you explain what that means?
Yeah, modern monetary theory is really kind of like this crackpot approach to public finance. It basically says that government should leverage It's monopolizing power on the ability to print money to basically fund anything and everything. So it's an inversion of monetary and fiscal policy, and what they want the government to do is just to basically self-finance all sorts of wild, extravagant projects on any spending priority that they have. So it's really wedded to things like the Green New Deal program. It's turning on the printing presses effectively. And they say that we can do this and not incur hyperinflation as long as we use the tax side of the equation on the fiscal end of policy to basically serve as like a braking lever of some sort to control inflationary pressures, which it doesn't really work. I mean, this is an inversion of the mechanics of monetary policy. And B, what it really ends up being is just like this rationale that they are putting forth for justifying tax hikes when they failed on that margin in other areas. But this modern monetary theory has really just kind of weirdly taken off, and it's done so just as we're emerging from probably the worst inflationary crisis in 40 years, and yet they're undeterred. Like we almost backslid into an MMT style approach with some of the pandemic era expenditures and handouts that came about from that. Mismanagement of monetary policy on the Federal Reserve side vis-a-vis the public expenditure side. And what did we get? Very, very rapid inflation. But they say, oh, no, that wasn't us. That's because the corporations were greedy. So you get all these nonsensical claims like that. Unfortunately, this is very pervasive on the political left right now. They've also tied it into this notion that inequality is supposedly soaring. It's the centerpiece of Joe Biden's tax narrative. You saw him go in the State of the Union and several times on TV. He always announces, well, we need to tax the billionaires more. The billionaires are not paying their fair share. It turns out that this is based on a essentially fabricated set of statistical claims that come out of Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman, these far left-wing economists that have said that inequality is skyrocketing, the rich are not paying their share. But if you dig into the numbers, and this is another thing that I've done in my own work, you find out that they are putting their thumb on the empirical scale. They are redefining what counts as a tax. They are redefining what counts as income. And if you do a more conventional, traditional way of assessing where the tax burden is distributed, it's the rich that are paying the lion's share far and away, and they have significantly higher rates than everyone else by intentional design. We have a progressive tax system. I see these as all coming up as election themes. They're all topics that the left seems to really be pushing their messages around, and yet they're rooted in some really horrendous slipshod economic research and motivated reasoning to try to get policy priorities of just massive spending and massive taxes. So it's the same old story with new rationales.
So just to make, before we move on to things happening on the right, which I think is probably more interesting to our listeners anyways, modern monetary theory, they're going to fiscally, print a bunch of money and inject it into the economy by way of, Congress is going to pass a bill, $200 billion for this thing or that thing. And then to prevent the inflation, we're just going to take all of the money back through taxation.
That's what they claim. They claim that they can do that. And I'm like, good luck. Look at the Washington, D.C. that we have. Not only are their mechanisms wrong, but this is political naivety to an extreme degree to think that they could be able to seamlessly execute even what they claim to do. So, like the whole thing is just a comedy of errors stacked on other errors and put forth as if this is like a viable economic theory. I'd liken it to economic astrology.
How different is it from like basic Keynesianism, where we're going to, in certain instances, use government deficit spending to jog demand in the economy and sort of get things set back up?
Right. Well, classical Keynesian approaches, they're basically on the fiscal side. There are derivatives that come later, monetary Keynesian, but classical fiscal Keynesianism says, if you go into a recession or a depression, you deficit spend through the duration of the depression to kind of counterbalance the business cycle. Now, there are other reasons why that might be imprudent, why that might be wrong. I'm not a Keynesian myself, but at least there's a plausible argument there. And the flip side to that is, and in times of prosperity, you cut back on the spending. And
Hmm.
Keynes himself would say that. It's like, if the economy is soaring, maybe you relax some of these public expenditure efforts that you used in the last recession or depression. So it's all just like counter-cyclical tools that are being used by the government to offset the ebbs and flows of the business cycle. And that's basic Keynesianism. Well, modern monetary policy basically throws that all out the window and says we should spend all the time as we want to, and we should only tax as a means of as a monetary rather than a fiscal lever. So it's a just complete inversion of even what a left-leaning Keynesian would say. And this is why you have people like Paul Krugman agreeing with me and saying, yeah, modern monetary policy is a bunch of nonsense.
All right, great. Let's move on to, in the remaining minutes,
Yeah.
best and worst ideas you're seeing on the right these days, in your
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. So I think some of the better ideas that are coming from the right, I think there are still commitments to streamlining the tax code. I mean, they have political uphill battles. There are commitments to lowering or at least holding the line and keeping taxes relatively low compared to where they were in previous years. I think the right does have a spending problem, just like the left does. It's whichever party is in power, they just shift the priorities that they spend on. But that's as old as government itself. I will nonetheless give the right at least some credit to at least touting the ideas that taxes should not be onerous, that taxes should not be used as like this massive redistribution mechanism. Where I do have some concerns on the right is, we're starting to see many members of the Republican Party drifting into things like industrial policy. The idea that we can revitalize middle America by having the government come in and subsidize certain strategic industries. They also do some of the things like some of Donald Trump's rhetoric around tariffs has been the same type of argument, as that we should exclude competitor goods to industries that we want to thrive, and this supposedly will bring manufacturing jobs back to America. It'll supposedly revitalize areas of the country that are economically stagnant right now. And I think the errors here, the issue here is this is a policy we've tried before. It was a while ago when we tried it. You have to go back to the 1930s for the last instance of a concentrated protectionist industrial policy attempt to revamp the economy. But we did that in 1930. It was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and it was the first attempt to respond to the Great Depression. So the stock market crashes, Congress is panicked, and like their version of a stimulus was, we need to adopt this massive tariff bill to protect our industries and ensure that we don't lose to the global economy, ensure that we don't lose our production in that to European powers and to other competitors abroad. So that was the rationale behind it. We bolster up industry at home and we weather the Depression. What really happened is it just ignited a massive global trade war. It was like the United States puts a tariff on Great Britain. Great Britain says, aha, well, we're going to put a tariff back on you. We put a tariff on Germany. Germany retaliates. We put a tariff on France. France retaliates. Next thing you know, the entire global trading system is in like this downward spiral to where it becomes a fraction of traded volume over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, and there's no means to withdraw from it because it means this de-escalation has to occur. So not only did the policy not achieve what it set out to do, it actually worsened the conditions of the Great Depression. So I would urge people on the right that are tempted by this narrative of we can achieve industrial greatness by conscious policy design, go look to the examples of the past, and you'll find very clear instances in 1930 onward that this was a series of mistakes. It was policy that they thought they could design, and what really happens, this is true of anything, any type of expenditure. When you put money on the table, you put benefits on the table, you put a favorable tax rate on the table for industry, all the lobbyists descend on Washington like vultures. They do it when the left proposes to spend. They do it when the right proposes to spend. And what that effectively does is, no matter how you try to craft the policy, lobbyists get their fingers into the baking process. They start inserting favorable rates for themselves that maybe are not necessarily tailored to what the initial policy set out to do, but because they are offering money and votes and support, Congress, politicians being politicians, are directly responsive to that. So very quickly, what starts as like this abstract plan to revitalize industry becomes this sclerotized, uh, immovable, lobbyist captured beast of an omnibus bill or something that's coming out of Congress, and like even the congressmen themselves can no longer control it because the lobbyists got the upper hand. And once that type of legislation is passed, it's like the Interstate Commerce Commission or the Social Security Act. These are things that are going to never go away. They'll last for 100 years, even outlive their own usefulness and existence, because there is lobbyist support and there are constituencies behind them.
Yeah, I hear all of that. Just full disclosure, I have an article
Sure.
coming out on Thursday defending the use of tariffs in a future administration. Just so this is, and it can be a fun conversation because I hear all of that. Corruption is a problem. The collective action problem certainly real, but I also, when we look at the history, I think of when Reagan saved the auto industry through import quotas from Japan, or more broadly, the American system in the Homesteading Act, which has a
Sure.
lot of this sort of wheeling and dealing, these omnibus bills. But to me, even given I don't want to see corruption and things of this sort, so there's certainly concerns. I think like a larger emphasis is that none of this is new, and that in the 19th century, the United States had the fastest growing economy in the world, despite even pretty significant tariff rates, things that would make Alexander Hamilton blush. So
Right.
I wonder what you think on maybe that focusing on the potential corruption or the sort of the lobbyists, the wheeling and dealing, that this is just this is just how politics is done. We have to live with it. We can maybe try and focus on how we can prevent some of the worst excesses of that. Maybe the Smoot-Hawley tariff is an example, or the tariff of abominations in
Right. Right.
1828.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
overall,
Those
you
are
have a
certainly
picture.
the worst instances from history. It's like when the vultures truly did descend because they started at an already protectionist rate, under 4D Macumber, which is the previous tariff. And it's like, let's accelerate that into Smoot-Hawley. No, I do look at the issue of like what happened in the 19th century for American economic growth. And this is an area I've worked quite a bit on. What it turns out is correlation is not necessarily causation. It's a
Right.
classic statistical issue here. And we can say, yes, absolutely, the United States did grow in the 19th century, and at least part of that period was under a high tariff regime. So then we start asking, well, what are the mechanisms that are going on here? Well, it turns out the United States was very unique in the 19th century. It's a geographically very, very large and diversified economy. One of the largest nation states in the world in physical space at that time, as it still remains. What does this mean? You actually have, when you erect tariff barriers on smaller states from Europe, which was the 19th century strategy, you actually have a very large internal economy that can absorb some of the burdens of that, absorb some of the costs of that. Because you have diversified manufacturing based in the Northeast, and then you have raw material production in the West. You have other sources you can get to that are not relied on international trade; they're reliant on an internal trade in the country. So that was kind of a unique circumstance in that point in history. The second thing you find out about it, if you compare the specific industries, the tariff beneficiary industries, and then there are other industries that are not regulated and not affected by tariffs so much. So like transportation becomes a major component of that. Utilities, electrification, things like that. You can't really put tariffs in the 19th century on electricity as that's emerging. It turns out that these industries, the non-tariff beneficiary industries, are actually growing at a faster rate than some of the conventional manufacturing industries that had heavy steel tariffs and things around them. So I look at that as a statistical exercise that tells me the tariffs cannot be the cause of prosperity in one industry and yet not the other industry, where they aren't even exercising a very heavy or meaningful supposed advantage, as is claimed. So you can do a comparative analysis on that and finds out, well, it just turns out the American economy was growing, period. And it was growing across both tariff industries and non-tariff industries at the same point in history. So that basically tells me that the tariff is overstated as a causal reason for that when you look to 19th century economic development.
Just in the case of electricity, you tell me, I mean, electricity was invented or sort of first commercialized in
Basically, yeah.
America, right? So there wouldn't be a
It's
foreign competitor to need protection against, as opposed to, say,
or a
manufacturing
means
or
to even bring it
textiles.
here. Yeah, but like electricity, generation of electricity is once you have the process. It's basically using hydroelectric power, using water to spin a wheel that turns a generator. This is a very easily developed process around the world. It's what basically the discovery itself that takes place, and then also transport. I mean, you can't really run an electrical line from Europe. So yes, there are distinctive features of that type of an industry that are specific to it. You turn to something like steel or iron. That's the more conventional area where
Right.
they argue for protection. And we had examples. I mean, you noted the Reagan example in the George W. Bush presidency. They
Yep.
they imposed like an emergency measure to supposedly relieve the American steel industry. This goes back to the Hamilton argument. They called it the infant industry argument. Is if you're entering into industrialization against a competitor, tariffs serve the mechanism of allowing the infant to grow up, allowing it to get on its feet. And that has been the argument since 1789 to basically the present day for protecting iron and steel. Turns out in practice, the baby never gets old. The baby never matures. It's the same industry, just keeps coming back over and over and over and over again for protection from competition abroad. And what we saw in the Bush example, and this is the early 2000s, they invoked an emergency measure, an escape clause tariff on steel to protect some of these major giant steel mill firms like Bethlehem Steel was probably the most prominent at the time, and Bethlehem itself dumped in tons of money into campaign cash, into funding re-election campaigns and members of Congress because they wanted the tariff to save themselves. Well, where's Bethlehem Steel today? It went bankrupt a few years later. So it's like the policy that they put all of their eggs in that basket of getting through and getting adopted. It provided them some temporary benefit, temporary relief for a couple of years, and then the same event happens anyway because they were being run as a very inefficient company, and all at economic harm, economic costs in other areas of the economy. You raise the price on steel. Well, who takes the brunt of that? It's not only you and I as consumers, the automobile industry that needs the steel to produce cars. So suddenly, Detroit is facing higher inputs of raw material, higher prices for inputs of raw material. They're not in the best economic shape. So there's like a ripple effect from one tariff done for ostensibly good reasons to help industrialize that play out in another industry that's kind of teetering and staggering. And that other industry now has to say, well, either you have to give us tariffs or you have to repeal this thing, or else you're putting us at a disadvantage. And it's just like a ripple effect across the entire economy. So I would argue this is a case where we like to think of ourselves as being able to strategically pick winners and losers, and I'm not saying in the abstract that that's impossible, but when it gets into practical politics, it always ends up being a much more complex game than the original portrayal happens to be. And that's exactly the point where all the corruption and lobbying interests enter in. And it's not just one; it's several successive industries that are dependent on other industries that are dependent on other industries, and suddenly every single one of them has a lobbyist on the payroll.
Okay. We got one time for, I think, one more
Sure, sure.
question if you're game for it. And I think maybe I'll ask the question this way. I think with the sort of tariff case, the argument is if we impose tariffs, it's going to reshift supply of goods and services to the domestic sphere as opposed to
Right,
importing
right,
goods, sort of try to rebalance the trade deficit,
right.
bring back and reshore manufacturing in particular, I think is the sort of the main sort of area of consternation. And I wonder if tariffs are not the way to go. What do you suggest as here's the best way that if you're advising Trump and you have
Yeah, yeah.
Ambassador Lighthizer and others who are saying we need
Right, right.
tariffs, you're Phil Magness. What's the way to go?
Deregulate. A lot of these areas of the country are under heavy, onerous, politicized environmental regulation from the climate change lobby. These activists that are basically saying, well, industry's dirty and it puts out carbon and other pollutants, and therefore we need to basically penalize it and force everyone into making nothing but electric cars, things like that. I see these as significant economic distortions that have come about even in the last 15 to 20 years because of the climate change lobby, which turns out it's not really affecting or doing anything meaningful to offset climate change. The United States is actually, relative to our industrial level, not one of the major polluters in the world. It's places like China. It's other places that are the real drivers of carbon emissions. But we followed this kind of like crazy far left fringe activist approach to using every regulatory tool in the bucket to try to force our economy to essentially deindustrialize through onerous regulation. And I would say first, focus on things like that. Second, tax relief. And that includes tax relief down at the state and local level. Do things that take the burdens off of the cost of living in areas where property values are so high that the entirety of your paycheck goes to your mortgage. You can do things like eliminate restrictions on land use and development, often, again, put in place for either environmental reasons or NIMBYism, not in my backyard. I don't want someone building something across the street from me. And this is why you see all the cities in America that have housing crises right now, where housing prices have shot through the roof. And there's almost no new building taking place, and people in the working class can barely even afford to live in San Francisco anymore, things like that. It's a regulatory induced economic climate caused by artificial restriction of the supply of housing. So I would say to someone, I'd say this to Trump or Biden if they were in power, if you want to alleviate the strain on ordinary Americans' pockets, get the government out of the housing regulation business, allow people to use and develop land, allow people to build. That injection of a housing supply will dramatically reduce the costs of living on just ordinary Americans there. And that's probably a bigger benefit that you could deliver to them directly than like these roundabout ways of taxing something from China.
Well, Phil, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Absolutely.
It's been fun. We'll have to do it again. We mentioned cracks in the ivory tower. What are some other things of yours or colleagues or things that you're working on that you'd recommend our listeners go check out?
Yeah, so I always urge people to go to our website, and that's independent.org. And we have basically daily content showing up there on a variety of issues that relate to free markets. They relate to the classical liberal intellectual tradition. We get in, that's right on the line between William F. Buckley and Milton Friedman is kind of the old pillars of free markets fused with tradition. So there's a lot of good content that I put up there. I also publish a variety of books and articles that come out on our website. I've written on the 1619 Project to Critique, so that's one of my other books. And I do a bunch of economic analysis on inequality and tax numbers, tax incidents, things like that. Some of it gets very technical, but I try to do accessible versions of it on independent.org.
Excellent. Very wide ranging, like our discussion.
Yes, it is. I mean, someone's going to fight the fight. So
Absolutely. Keep up the good work. Thanks again, Phil.
you as well. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.